All right, good morning and welcome to Live Adult Religious Education through the Orthodox Christian Network and the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George in Bethesda, Maryland. Sorry we're running late, had a little bit of technical difficulty. Hi, Tina. So we're going to jump right in. Welcome back from Thanksgiving. I know it's been a couple weeks. So today, the lesson is called The Truth About Orthodox Christianity and Thanksgiving. A little bit untimely since Thanksgiving's passed, but considering Thanksgiving is the central act of our worship, which I'll get into, it's always timely. This is a little unusual for me. What I'm doing today, actually, I'm teaching from someone else's blog. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but I do a lot of reading, as you might imagine. I'm sure all of you do much reading. And there was a particular blog from Father Stephen Freeman that made a particular impression on me. I've been reading Father Stephen for years. When I wrote my book, Sacramental Living, Understanding Christianity as a Way of Life, my creative process, if you will, is I put all my thoughts down on anything I'm doing first, and then I go back and validate, read other things, and making sure that whatever I'm teaching in written form or podcast form is in keeping with our holy tradition. So I spent a lot of time. And during that time, I discovered when I was writing the book, which took about 8 years off and on, I didn't know it was going to be a book at first. So anyway, I kind of meandered. But towards the end of that 8-year period, before the book was published, I discovered Father Stephen Freeman. And since I was very oriented, the book was very much based on the understanding about sacramental reality, the understanding of reality as one reality, physical and material reality, or physical and spiritual reality, and the whole sacramental nature of reality. I found Father Stephen, and he's a very brilliant man that articulates truth about that reality very, very well. And so I just glommed on him. Anyway, he wrote a blog called Thanksgiving as Mystical Communion. And I wanted to paraphrase some of his thoughts, intersperse some of my own, and then we can have a discussion. So here's what he said. Like I said, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to paraphrase, and I'll try to make a distinction when I'm sharing something that's just my own thoughts. Not to discredit him if my thoughts not particularly good. So he says that we all have a propensity to put things in neat little boxes, good and bad, light and dark, easy, hard, and how all this equates to either it makes us happy or unhappy. And then he said he believes it's very easy for us to be thankful for the good things in life, right? And the reality, of course, our days and our lives are a mix of all these things, the good and the bad. But he says the modern person seeks to maximize the good and minimize the bad. And I should let you know that Father Stephen is very critical of modernity. Some of it I agree with him, some of it I don't. I'll get into it. But he's very critical of modernity. But he's a very happy guy. If you ever spend time with him, he's an upbeat guy. He's been through his own struggles with panic attacks and anxiety, which he admits freely. So he's been through the mill like all of us, so he can speak about it. But he's an upbeat guy, but he's very critical about modernity. He sees modernity very much through a dark lens. So he says the modern person seeks to maximize the good, minimize the bad. And then he quoted, a song President Reagan liked from the 40s. He said, the verse goes, "You got to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative, no room for Mr. In Between." And he says, this is modernity in its essence. It's the modern myth, he calls it, the mythology of everything being bound up with making a better world. And the notion, what he says is, through the proper application of science and technology, we can make the world a better place. Excuse me. So meaning that we'll be able to eliminate, eventually, somehow, we'll be able to eliminate the negative or most of the negative and maximize our pleasure. And pleasure is equated with good, and suffering is equated with bad, or seen as inherently bad. So for me personally, now I'm getting into, I think this is the root cause of a lot of our troubles. And, you and I were talking earlier, John, about spiritual sobriety. And I think sometimes a lack of spiritual sobriety to be able to contextualize the good and the bad, the joy and the suffering in a realistic way within our faith. I think that gets in the way. The reason I say that is because, and I think Father Stephen would agree with this, that we all have 1, 2, 3, who knows how many. We have critical moments in our lives where things get rough. And if we're not spiritually sober, we may miss what God is trying to either do with that moment for us, or even more basic, not understand that he is present with us even in those dark moments. And it's that recognition that's often what enables us to keep going on, having that Christian hope, right? It kind of reminds me tangentially of when Jesus was going into Jerusalem and he wept over Jerusalem. He said, you've missed the time of your visitation. And it wasn't like they were going to be punished because they missed it, but a natural consequence of missing it, was what happened to him. So I think sometimes that's where this notion he's getting about can affect us. Of course, that's debatable. So, and what he says, in the first part of his blog, he ends with saying, modernity seeks to turn the world into a candy store without diabetes. He's got a sense of humor. And he says one of the manifestations of this modernity or the modern myth of false philosophy is safe spaces or safe places, right? I think we see them a lot on college. We hear about them on college campuses. I've been down to my daughter's college campus 4 or 5 times now. I've never seen that or heard any of them talk about it. So I don't know what sometimes is purported in the media versus how much it meets with reality. But we hear a lot about in news, at least I do, where it seems like it's characterizing students as so emotionally fragile, they need to go to safe places where there's the mildest of trouble or insults that come their way. I actually taught this topic on my Thursday night Zoom class I do the first and third Thursdays of every month. And somebody, rightly so, challenged this notion and said, you know what, we all need safe places. And I would agree. On occasion, we need that place to retreat to that feels safe to us where we can regroup. But I think what he's talking about is a greater extrapolation of that, trying to make the world a safe space or a safe place, which is unrealistic. So just in case someone was having that thought, I wanted to create that distinction. And he says we want to make a world without discomfort or contradiction, in that this is a world none of us really want to live in, his assertion. So, and I agree with him there. I think there is really no real life or real participation in life without ambiguity, contradiction, hurt, negative emotion, positive emotion. And I think sometimes, this is me again, that all of this emphasis we have today, it seems at least it seems it for the younger generation, what I experienced raising my daughter, who's now college age, there's so much focus on feeling and emotion and self-esteem that it was almost, well-intended, of course, I think. Others would argue about the Frankfurt School from Germany and getting all those ideas in, but ultimately crippling to some extent, or potentially crippling, because that, again, that's not real life. Now, as I said, he comes across in his writings and his teachings as a harsh critic. I myself think there's a lot of good things about modernity, but as I've said often in this room, it's like if your child comes home with all good grades and 1 bad grade, you tend to focus sometimes, at least I do. So I tend to focus on what I think needs to be fixed, but just to draw a distinction where I'm coming from versus where he's coming from. So, and he says in his blog, his critique of modernity has nothing to do with technology, medicine, science, etc. And none of that's modern. And I think any rudimentary student of history would see none of that's modern. Maybe certain advances are modern, right? We've advanced certain aspects of medicine, science, technology, but it's always been with us. So, just changes and improves. So he says that modernity is a set of ideas, not a time in history, and it's subtle propaganda to pass itself off as a historical period. So to be unmodern, he says, if you feel you're unmodern, is to be out of date, backward, Neanderthal, positively medieval, or some such descriptions. And he ends the second part of his blog. Modernity is propaganda parading as history. So now here's the first big takeaway as it relates to Thanksgiving and thankfulness. He says it's a set of ideas that is also inherently ungrateful, or the result is creating people that become inherently ungrateful, that buy into the modern myth. He then quotes a prayer, and I will read this prayer. You may be familiar with it, or familiar with at least Metropolitan Philaret's version, or maybe this is just written a different way. But because it sounds a lot like the prayer Metropolitan Philaret's prayer that you'll find in the Orthodox Study Bible as part of the morning prayers. It says, "Lord, grant that I may meet all that this coming day brings to me with spiritual tranquility. Grant that I may fully surrender myself to thy holy will at every hour of the day, direct and support me in all things. Whatsoever news may reach me in the course of the day, teach me to accept it with a calm soul and the firm conviction that all is subject to thy holy will. Direct my thoughts and feelings and all my words and actions and all unexpected occurrences. Do not let me forget all is sent down from thee. Grant that I may deal straightforwardly and wisely with every member of my family, neither embarrassing nor saddening anyone. So he said when he first learned that prayer, he said he struggled with it. It really constituted with him wrestling with God. And I can see why. I think we've all been there at some point trying to, when we have rough times, to really accept that that's either from God or God's permitting that, or why is this happening to me? All those kind of thoughts before we get maybe spiritually mature and sober and realize that these things will happen. So he asked himself some questions. He said, is God at work? Is God at work in all things, and are all things being brought about to a good conclusion? That's a question he asked himself. Are the terrible things that happen to me or to another devoid of God, or are they somehow the work of the cross within history? Very important question. He concluded this: God does not stand outside of history manipulating, controlling one thing or another, aloof and judging. The cross of Christ is not a single event of 3-hour duration, a mere payment for sin, as it's taught sometimes, as if it's just that. The cross is a revelation of a mystery at work that has been hidden from the ages, but that has always been true. And here's the second big thing. And this is me, by the way. He didn't say these are the big things. I'm saying what they are, but these big things to me. He says he said, Christ is the lamb slain from the foundations. That's a quote from Revelation 3:18. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that scripture. So now I want to extrapolate on that. This may get a little heady, so forgive me if I don't articulate it well. Because what if you read the book of Revelations in this scripture, what that's saying is the crucifixion wasn't something that just happened 2,000 years ago at a point in time. It is just like the Eucharist. It is a timeless event in our existence, right? So, and remember, we're inside time, right? We're human beings. We're born, we live, we die, we experience time as linear. So, okay, so hold on to that thought. And then remember, heaven is not up there and hell is not down there, right? Heaven is all around us. It's a spiritual reality that we don't perceive in its fullness yet. Okay, so lack of time. So where I'm getting at, and third point, there's no the crucifixion is never separate from the resurrection. They always go together. So putting all that together, what we know is, these are forever eternal events that we experience. So what does that mean to us? Well, what it can mean to us, if we understand it, is that when we're suffering, right? Maybe we're all suffering now, but I think all of us in this room, and maybe those listening, can also, if you are suffering, have joy, right? We have joy in our lives. We can recognize the joy even amidst our suffering. Why is that? Because they go together. And Christ said, in this world trouble will come, but he promises, the Christian hope, and Father Stephen talks about this, not in this article, but the truth. Christianity is all about the truth of our Lord defeating death, right, and giving us eternal life. It's not really a self-help system. Father Stephen and others will say, if you're looking for self-help, Christianity may not be the best place to go. C.S. Lewis himself said, I was looking for that. A bottle of port will do a better job than Christianity, right? but above all of that is this hope, right? This hope of this truth. And from what trickles down from that, I guess we brought up Reagan, we talked trickle down spirituality, right? Is a foretaste of that hope through the joy, even amidst the suffering. So that's what I think that's why I included that in this article. So we can remember, even when we're going through trials and tribulations, the joy we have is a foretaste of the eternal joy we will have with Christ. But not right now, because we all know that Christ said, in this world trouble will come, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And he promises, we live in that time between the first and second coming, and this is where we endure our struggles for our growth. But if that really can sink in, you're not going to have peace every second of every day. That's just, but you'll have a greater measure of peace, more and more, as we struggle, because this truth will sink in as truth. At least my experience has been, first is ponder it, then kind of accept it here, but then eventually it gets down into here, where you start saying to yourself, you know what? I think I actually believe this. You know what I'm saying? People will never admit that, but that's really the faith journey, right? We all, publicly, maybe we put on more of, but in our private moments, we wrestle with these things that we ponder up here before they sink down, and it's usually moments in time or events that clue us into what we believe. So, and it usually comes through trials more so than revelation. So, I'm going to quote now. I'm going to get back. I'm going to quote something that Father Stephen said directly. He says, Christ reveals to this, and this is really important. Christ reveals to us that he not only loves those who suffer, but he becomes those who suffer. Matthew 25:40. Hence, you'll see why I assigned some of the readings. We'll talk about that. Christ becomes what we are, uniting us to himself that we might become what he is. On the cross, we see not only the suffering of God, but the suffering of the whole world. Everywhere and through all time. Like Joseph the patriarch, we are able to say of suffering, you meant it to me for evil, but the Lord meant it to me for good. Genesis 50:20. And that's why I put in that reading about Joseph the patriarch, because his brothers were afraid he was going to kill him. He was in a position of power because they had betrayed him. But Joseph, in those critical moments, recognized the truth, right? So he didn't hold it against them. He was able to say, you know what? I can see now what God was doing. Even though you meant it for me for harm, God was bringing good out of it. And that resulted in him having no ill feeling or animosity, because he saw God's hand in the weakness of his brother's actions. But I think what I draw from that, when I think about suffering and being able to give thanks, is I think my instinct, at least, is when I'm really at low moments, to pray. I'm kind of looking up, God, help me. But I'm like, you know what? He's not up there. He's right here, right? Christ has become this. And I think it's hard sometimes to really let that sink in, that when, you look at me or I look at you and we know each other's suffering, to see Christ in that and to think he's enduring that at the same time. But yet I don't know if I included this or not, but yet, we read in Hebrews 4 something or other. I think it's in the readings. He went through everything we went through, everything. That's why in our temptations, he's able to help us, because he went through everything. And I think, at least for me, sometimes it's hard to really feel that truth, that he really did go through these human experiences, right? And that's why the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25, the part I selected for the reading, 31 through 40, it's really important, because what he's telling us there, those sheep, they are the ones that knew this truth, and they saw God in the suffering of others, whether they consciously acknowledged it or not. Their love of fellow human being demonstrated that they lived this truth. And that's why it's so important. We have to live our faith, not just believe it. They instinctively just helped people, right? So anyway, so this is a reason he concludes. I'm almost done my opening. I know it's going a little longer, but this is what he concludes, that this is why we were able to offer thanksgiving, not because suffering or bad things in themselves are good, but that Christ is within them and has changed them and transformed them to something that is and will result in good. And we can give thanks for that, knowing that whatever we're going through, it's not the end of the story. It never will be the end of the story. So we can hang on to those things as we have a foretaste in our present, and we look to the future. It's also a reminder too what Thanksgiving really is. Part of it is your own attitude of your heart, but more so than that, it's a continual act of offering and sacrifice. That's what we do in the liturgy, and that's what we do for each other. That's why he quotes in the article, "Thine own of thine own we offer to thee on behalf of all and for all," because that's what's going on. God gives us the gifts, we refashion them, offer them back to him. He transforms them. That's what, in that process of transformation, we understand this whole notion of transformation in other aspects of our life as well. God is constantly transforming everything. So, and we should continue to do good. We should just not understand that it's necessarily going to make the world some utopian better place. That this cycle we're in, or whatever you want to call it, will be continual until the end of time. He also points out too that evil will continue to happen, and he says, I don't know if he was sarcastic, although I can hear him saying this. Much of it will be done in the name of making the world a better place. You know? And I think we could look back and see some of our advances, technological, whatever, that had good intent and had good result, but also have potential, negative consequences too. So he ultimately concludes, and maybe I'll stop here, is that modernity cannot bear suffering, and the whole Christian journey is one of learning how we bear that with hope, with love, with joy. And really, that's our task, is to bear our own and bear it with others, and be loving. And I guess I'll conclude with this before we can open up the discussion. I said this the other night in my class, and they said they felt very uplifted. So I hope this is coming across that way. Sometimes I feel like I'm a downer because of the topics I'm picking, but I'm not trying to be. I'm not trying to be anything. These topics are on my mind because I encounter it so much. But what I want to get across, and I hope it's coming across, is the greater truth of all of that, the truth within it and the truth behind us, which is Christ's love and Christ's joy, which is available to everyone. And my examples have been, more often than not, when I see people, because of the stuff I do, the quotes of the day, this and some other things, I get a fair amount of feedback from people, and I hear some really rough stories. And I'm encountering them in person too, but yet there's so much joy and so much hope. It's like, okay, so that's just a testament to the reality of this, the truth of this. And so really, my selection of some of these things isn't to be dark or whatever. It's actually the opposite, to try to do my best to show the light within it. So anyway, I will stop there. I made some notes about some points to raise, why I selected scriptures, but now I'll just open it up for comments or questions from anybody, or challenges. I got challenged the other night, and it actually it ended up being a really good dialogue. So.
My challenge as an Orthodox person is, how do you answer someone? I get this all the time, and I think it's because they know I'm a priest or whatever, but when people say, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? I have a really difficult time answering that without sounding condescending, I guess. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what a good...
I can't promise I won't sound condescending. I know what I usually say and what comes to mind. Let me preface it by saying I try to gauge as best I can the attitude of the person. And if they're really looking for a fight, I won't say what I'm about to say, right? But if it seems like, I always think about the parable of the rich man, right? Why do you call me good? No one is good. So I try to explore, well, what do you mean by good, right? Number one. And then, and that can be successful or can fail miserably, depending on the person I'm talking to. And then I just try to remind what I said about here, that the promise of our faith, whether we want this or not, has never been that life's going to be easy. That's not what Christ said. When we ask that question, we should know really what the faith says, and then to the person, you can decide whether you believe that or not. But Christ said, in this world, trouble will come. And God doesn't favor persons, and He allows, So I mean, I don't. Those aren't my exact words. That's where I go. And honestly, Tina, sometimes it seems to bear fruit, and there's a good discussion. Sometimes I get a cynical response that's just cop out. I get that a lot, actually, because a lot of people that are asking that question, they're really struggling, and they're looking for comfort that won't come through the teaching and words. It'll come more from the interaction of the person. So I don't know. And ultimately, I don't have a satisfying answer. I guess what I'm getting to. But, so that's what I struggle. That's how I struggle to answer that. To people listening, this is the uncomfortable silence where we're pondering. See if we have more questions. They say when you're teaching a class, let the uncomfortable silence linger. But I'm filling it up with filling up the dead space with talking. I'm going to let it linger for a moment.
All right, so then I'm going to fill in that space.
Okay.
And it's not a discomfort space. It's the fact that, for me, what you're talking about is quite challenging. Mm-hmm. And part of this is, again, what we talked about repeatedly here, and that is that we keep trying to assign our human intellect to understanding the mind of God, and we generally fail at that. But it's tough for us because we come to believe that we are masters of the universe, we control everything in our world, and especially in a very affluent society, we like to feel that we have great control over our well-being. And then there are things that happen that are inexplicable, and there is suffering at all different levels, and we don't know why these things happen. And sometimes that's all we can say. We don't know why they happen. But something that you said about joy and sorrow reminded me of something that I learned about for the first time, and it's still difficult to process, but I keep thinking about it at my father's funeral. That was in April of 2015. And we had a bishop there who was presiding over the funeral. And we went through the beautiful funeral service up in New York. And then after it was over, he explained to us that in the Orthodox Church, we're grieving because we love this person so much. And the more you love someone, the deeper the pain of their loss. But heaven is rejoicing because they are welcoming the soul. And so while my mother is inconsolable and my brother and I are trying to take care of her and our relatives and whatnot, the bishop, very, very sweetly, very softly, is telling us this is why we're grieving, and it's perfectly understandable, and it's what we do at a funeral. But heaven is rejoicing that this man, this soul, is now in the bosom of Christ, however he exactly defined it. And I've grappled with that for the last 6.5 years. But it somewhat encapsulates our complete inability to understand how we pair the suffering here with either the joy elsewhere or the joy in our lives. And the contradictions that you refer to play out right there.
Yeah.
So it's not easy, but, and this is a very important but, what you talk about is never dark and never a downer. That's a modern Western therapeutic approach, right? What you need to be telling us and what everyone needs to be telling each other is what is true. So it doesn't matter if it's happy talk or sad talk, downer or upper or whatever, adjectives we want to use. What we need to know is what is the truth according to God, according to Christ, according to our church, and then do our best to bring that truth into our lives, into our relationships, into our understanding of the world. So don't ever feel like you've got to defend your comments by saying, I don't want to be a downer. That's the therapeutic trap of everything we do has to be all happy talk.
Well, right. It is a trap.
It is,
and if I gave into the trap,
we all fall into it.
Well, we do. But so if I gave into the trap, I wouldn't even have this lesson.
I'm not singling you out.
No, I know.
I'm as guilty as anyone else. But all I'm saying is this is what we do to each other, right? We're caught up in a Western affluent world where happiness right, is the great objective. And anything that pulls us away from happiness is something to be avoided.
Totally. And actually, I wasn't defending myself. The point I was making, that I was trying to make is that you're absolutely right. Father Alexander Schmemann was all about that. He'd say, we have to say the truth. That's what I try to do. Because, we all know each other. We all know our trials and tribulations, or some of them at least. And is that when I teach the Zoom class, I know some of the people. I think we're more effective. And this is what I try to, whether I fail at it or not, it's a different story. But in saying that, I was trying to be sensitive to the fact that when you're on the receiving end of a message like that, of that truth can be hard to receive depending where you're at. And so someone wielding the truth like a club isn't a good way to reach someone's heart. But trying to wield it with not departing from the truth, but in a softer way to make it more palatable, so to speak, to a heart. That's what I try to gauge. Sometimes I succeed, I suspect. Sometimes I fail. But that's really the method behind what I do, why I bring that up. Because I recognize, I've been there too. When I'm going through the most miserable time, the truth hasn't always been easy to hear, right? Because it doesn't feel, we do live in the West, so when we're not happy. I mean, as a matter of fact, texted my daughter the other day. I was telling her something, and I wrote to her, I just hope you're happy. And I wrote after it, oh my gosh, I sound like my mother, right? Because I was just lecturing her, because part of my notes here, I personally don't process my thinking based on happy or not happy. I don't really process. I'm not Spock, but I don't process it through the lens of feeling or emotion because I've lived long enough to know there's going to be good feelings, bad feelings, and really the way to have that internal order within yourself is to do what you're supposed to do regardless of how you feel. Sometimes you'll feel good. So I processed, and I was lecturing my mother, and then of course I think my guardian angel gave me a little slap because he showed me my hypocrisy as I said the only thing to my own child, right? I just want you to be happy, and I do feel that way. We all feel that way about our kid. I just want you to be happy, but in doing so, John, we're me and others that do that, we are perpetuating the Western, Father Stephen would call the Western myth in a bad way, myth as a lie. So, and you brought up your father. I almost said this during the lesson, but I shied away from now. Well, I remember when my father died, 2004, out of the blue. Suddenly, I got a phone call, and I say this with caution, but I learned something about myself about death that day, and I don't want to learn any more about it, frankly, because I don't want any more loved ones to die, but I know it will. Is that I grieved for his passing, but I never became morose about it. Because first of all, my dad was a funny, great guy. We didn't have any baggage between us, so there was nothing unsaid. But I never, to this day, never lost that feeling that a bus came and got him and took him someplace, and I'll get on that bus one day. And so it wasn't a sense of permanence. And I thought to myself, I even talked to the priest at the time. I was like, am I just cold? Because I remember my funeral, other people breaking down, and I never got I was sad, but never that level of sad. And we were close. So I think that's what I meant by and then after that, I felt confident to talk a little bit about death, because I think one of the things I try to do is I don't really want to talk about anything I don't feel I have some degree of experience with, because then I feel like we're falling into that Western trap of trying to impart the faith through this and not through this. But I caution myself, it's different than a spouse or a child or anything. That's a different, we expect our parents to go. So I'm not going to claim that I look at anybody in the eye and say, I know where I am with death. I don't. I know where I was then. And maybe now, I don't know. But I think it's those experiences we face. And I think that's one of the reasons God allows us to face them, because they do help us get to that place of spiritual sobriety. I won't say it here, but I wrote a poem the other day called The Abyss, because I was thinking about, and actually I sent it to a friend of mine who tried to commit suicide at one point, and I said to her, did this capture, because I was trying to get to that I was trying to capture that illusion of despair that grips people sometimes. And the first part of the poem was dark, but the second part was light, as the person really realized after they faced the abyss, they weren't alone. He felt hands on him. He felt other people there, and came back to the light. And I think that's the great truth of our faith. It really offers us that hope. But if people, we talked about it last week, Man's Search for Meaning. People that don't have that true hope in their heart, they wither during the suffering, or withering through the dark times. So anyway, you thank you for that comment. That was a good comment.
Thank you for inspiring.
So, what else? Any other thoughts before I raise a few things? Andrew.
I was just thinking that as you talk about modernity, there's the impatience. We're constantly looking at instant gratification. No one wants to go to the doctor and be told, well, if you exercise and get sunshine and eat well, in a year or two, you may be feeling better. You may, be able to battle this without medication. Everybody wants that magic pill that's going to make them better in a day, in a week, in 2 weeks. I mean, look at our merchandising system in the United States. We have Amazon Prime, and we're so spoiled with Amazon Prime now that we see that product is limited since COVID. When your items are delayed 24 hours or 48 hours, we're like, my cocoa didn't show up at the door for my birthday party, this weekend. But all of that demand for immediate satisfaction is in direct contrary to what we believe is faith, right? So it's that seed, watering that seed. And it doesn't just grow into a tree to give you shade overnight. It takes years. It takes a lifetime to get to that shade. So our modern society and the way our society has changed the way we think about things is in direct opposite of what we are as Orthodox Christians.
Absolutely. I think that I wrote a couple of notes as you were talking, just things that came to mind. I remember I think we talked about in here some lesson some time ago. Just the parable of the mustard seed, how it's the smallest one and it grows. Well, and then of course it doesn't grow until it gets bruised. Remember we talked about that. So we have to get bruised to grow too. And then it takes a while. One of your boys is out there.
Different context. Speaking of it in the context of kind of contradictory to Andrea's point, and I guess Father, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move that mountain. So that can be instant. There is an element of it. I wouldn't say. I mean, what Henry said is spot on in that context, but it's because we're people of faith and because we pray and because we have those relationships. That we can, filter that out and actually survive. I mean, I don't think I've shared this in this room. I know I did. I think the one men's fellowship we missed when we did it via Zoom. I know earlier this year there was a time when I literally felt like that. That probably would have been a good thing, right about then, compared to how I was feeling. But it was at that very moment when I felt my worst that I felt prayers from others who I knew were praying for me, keeping me going and uplifting me. So I think part of what this is training ourselves, like you said, to be open.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in modernity, I think Father Stephen's right, that sort of close minds us because we're thinking happiness and instant gratification instead of being open to what's there, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. We're not open to the things that you said during the lesson. We're not always open to the lessons that are there, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. Because I know for myself, I've felt the power of prayer before, but not like that. Not like that. Not where I was like, I'm in so much pain and I'd be better off, that feeling.
At your lowest moment.
Yeah. I feel like death, but then something, and to me it's inexplicable, but just, something came over me to get me, lifted me up past that. The pain was still there, but and in my head I was still having some of these thoughts, but then you start to filter it with your nous, and the prayer just, I don't know, the best way I can describe it is, some of it was being delirium from so many different drugs going through your pulsing through your body, but in some lucid moments, just I never felt like this before. I felt prayer before, but not like that. It's very difficult to articulate, but I felt just uplifted like I'd never felt before, and I felt like that was straight coming from prayers, not my own.
Absolutely, I'm sure it was. That's I've gone through something similar to that in a very low moment too. I remember being in my study, probably at the lowest moment in the last 4 or 5 years of my life, and I really thought that my greatest fears were going to come true in my adult life, the things I feared the most. And I remember at that moment I felt something, and it felt like other people too. But then a scripture went into my head. And it was a scripture that basically reminded me that what I needed to do, regardless of the outcome, regardless of anything. And with that came a peace, because I was like, this is what I need to do. may not work out.
Yeah.
You know, the rest of the world may see me as a doormat or something, through a criticism, but this is what I need to do. And it felt uplifting. And then not too soon after, phone calls, conversations made me realize that all this was a result of many people praying, intercessory. That's what it gets down to.
One of the greatest things I've ever seen in my life was a little cave a few miles from Avenue Village, one of my fellow campers back in the 70s. She could hear, but she had been born deaf in one of her ears, her left ear. And there was a 1,200, probably more than that, year old icon. I'm trying to remember when that iconoclasms occurred. I want to say that was what?
The 8th century.
I think 787 was the council, I think, roughly, something like that. Yeah.
1,200 years.
Yeah.
There was some icons because some of the monks nearby had taken some of the icons from the churches and hidden them in caves. We went to this monastery because it was just a 2 or 3 mile hike from the camp. I remember the young lady doing her cross and kissing an icon, and she, within seconds, passed out. They had to bring medical attention. She said when she kissed the icon, she had felt like a pop or an explosion in her head, and it caused her to pass out. And then, she'd been born deaf in her left ear, and then suddenly she could hear.
Praise God.
Came back.
Speaking of passing out, I'm all over this heat.
It's an amazing story.
So
I love
You know,
hearing stories like that. I mean,
that at that time, the tingling when you see miracles, because I didn't know her well, but I talked to her and knew that she had always had to speak into her right ear because she couldn't hear. But then when she came, she had to take her to the hospital for a day or two, and when she came back, it was like, wow. Sometimes we forget that God, like you said, is here in this world and does miracles every day, but we're not always open to perceive them. We don't have that spiritual sobriety, that spiritual eyesight, that openness to receive the everyday, miracles that happen for us. And that's why that's kind of the balance, I think, that we have to kind of keep in perspective, whether it be modern times, ancient times. I think, and in our culture, we've always taught, the golden mean, the things in moderation. And I think it's applicable here because life really is a balance between good and bad, and it's learning to be able to treat those two strangers the same, as a well-worn cliche goes. And I think if we're able to do that, then we can experience the joy that Christ promises us, because we like you said, we get that little bit of taste. If we have with communion and other sacraments, we get that ever so little hint, kind of like walking into a kitchen during the, like when you're a kid, you don't, something more around online that makes a lot of sense to me, that, you may not remember what you got when you were 6 or 8 years old, for Christmas, but you remember some of the smells around the holidays of the cooking and family being together. Those are the things that bring back, the memories, and in a lot of ways, Orthodoxy is like that because we use all of our senses.
yeah.
It's the same thing where we have to learn how to apply ourselves, and sometimes that means we have to be humbled.
Often we have to. I think you said a lot of things there. Right? Several things come to mind. Let me see if I can glue them together without sounding like I'm going in disparate directions. But you talked about just enough. I think sometimes we can lose sight of the practical, what Christ teaches us. Give us this day our daily bread. Don't worry about tomorrow. Today has enough trouble of its own. We only get enough for that day. Remember the manna in the desert when they tried to hoard it? It all rotted, right? And what's the Western? More is better, right? So we have, everything about Western culture is almost diametrically opposed to living our faith the way we should. So God allows us, he gives us just enough. That's probably all we can handle, frankly. So we continue to grow. And why do we grow? Well, you talked about your senses. Well, many of the Holy Fathers, in a very pragmatic way, talked about the nous like it was another sensory organ. just like we try to take care of all of our, our ears, our eyes, whatever. What do we need to do to take care of the nous, which is really how we see and perceive reality? And it's not that hard, right? It's not that hard how we do it. It's the sacramental life of the church. What becomes hard is our commitment to actually doing it. Then you mentioned balance, another Western myth, right? Balance means everything's kind of in its neat little place. But Christian balance is nothing like that. Christian balance is simple. God first. Everything else flows from that. That's our balance, right? We seek first, Matthew 6:33, seek first his kingdom. But we don't always do that. We line up our religious life here. We do that. So right. And then I think on the top, the other thread that occurred to me as you're talking is one of the failures often of our faith, or not our faith, but of teaching it, is we stray from teaching the hard truth, right? Because we make the gospel in many circles, has become a sales pitch for salvation. Father Andrew Damick, in his book, Arise, I'm sorry, Father, I don't think he's listening to this, but he is, I apologize, can't remember the title. But one of the first things he does in his book is reminds us what the gospel is not. It's not a sales pitch. And so, again, people leave the faith or become spiritual without religious because they investigate it. They're like, wow, okay, what's this? So I'll go to heaven. What about now? Or there's no app. It's made something it's not. So we try to sell it just as some other self-help system, right? We got to really, and in the end, Christ told the truth. He was the truth. He is the truth, right? And when remember in John 6, the hard truth of the Eucharist, he goes, "Are you going to leave me too?" Peter's like, well, we have no place else to go. Wasn't exactly our endorsement to why we're following you. But sometimes the truth can be very difficult, but we shouldn't shy away from it. But I think, all those things add up sometimes to just the challenge of living in a Western culture, not only for us that strive to live the faith within it without having seeds of doubt sometimes to get us, although it's not all bad. That causes us to wrestle. But the other thing, Stephen, I think one of the things, the ultimate point I really like what you made many good points, was, just proof that it's often in our darkest moments, often facing that abyss. And I wish I could remember what Holy Father said that. Because one of the pet peeves me and some other teachers have is when we throw out Holy Fathers but don't specifically say one, because so many people say the Holy Fathers say this, and they're totally misrepresenting what the Holy Fathers say. They can't name one. I'm doing the same thing. But I remember one Holy Father I talk about, when you were able to stare into that abyss of your life and you walk away with the comfort of knowing God, right? And I think that's not exactly something anybody in the West wants to hear. It's not a message of happiness. You want to be happy? Face your abyss. Okay, cool. It's not gonna. And Andrew, I made a note, something you said too, I want to bring up. I think this whole COVID thing has really exposed some of the pathology of Western culture. Just like you said, I was talking to someone the other day. They owned a restaurant. Maybe was it in here? I can't remember. But they were saying to me that customers of 20 years, they had to tell them not to come back because of the way they were treating the wait staff. I mean, just COVID, it just exposed a lot of this stuff. Lack of immediacy. I was talking to a vendor the other day, and something didn't come, and I was like, I just called to see when it's coming, and I prefaced it saying, look, I know COVID's got everything messed up or whatever. I just want to know, is it coming? Should I? And she commiserated with me because she was happy to have a pleasant call. Just people complaining, it's like, so I don't know. So I think Father Stephen ultimately is right about a lot of it. And he is, like I said, he's a fun, upbeat guy. But I look around at things too. I see, statistics. I hope they're true about less poverty. Medical advances. People that my cousin died of leukemia in 1972. He would be alive today, but today is advanced. So there's good things going on too. It's not all dark out there. And I think, despite how the news comes across, I do believe most people, I think, go throughout their day doing decent things, not doing particularly terrible things. I think the problem we have a lot is evil people have exponentially greater access to things, right? That can really harm the world, harm other people. So, but many people I've read, many priests, authors, whatever, talk a lot about You know, like when you step on a snake, it wriggles its last death throes. That we live in the time of the devil's last death throes, right? Roaring like a lion, but completely impotent to somebody that won't receive him. So even though he's trying to cause all kinds of havoc, and then God takes all that havoc and says, "Okay, I'm going to bring good out of it. You can't win." You know, but you know, again, that's really a hard mindset to adapt into the Western person, and even in faith, it gets hard sometimes. Stephen,
It is, but it's like we say in here a lot that the Christian life is never going to be easy.
Mm-mm.
But just as humans, you know, maybe it's our upbringing, but you know, we're always taught, you know, life is good, but life isn't always fair. And when bad things happen, it, you know, you talked about the character thing. When you get shook up, you know, what comes out is a reflection of your nous, of your inner character. Is it going to be that, you know, 12 step or, you know, 6 or 7 steps of, you know, anger and frustration? Or is it going to be, you know, joy and gratitude and, like the lesson here, thankfulness, or understanding, like you're talking about the phone call you had with the vendor? I mean, it really is attitude that determines a lot of that. And, you know, guilty, there are things like client calls up complaining about something and you go, oh, you know, somebody else didn't do what they were supposed to do, and now I look terrible.
Right.
And I think to myself, well, you're having that mindset. Let's just go in, you know, do what needs to be done, you know, make people satisfied. I never like the term happy because if you're happy, you can be unhappy. And at least in business, for how I feel, is satisfied clients come back. You know, happy clients can become unhappy and never come back. You know, and I think that's true in life. I think we look for a certain satisfaction versus happiness or unhappiness.
I'll end on, you said about fair, so I'll end on humorous note. At least I think it's humorous. Whenever I hear fair, I always think of, I always see theology in the most unusual places. I think theology of the Brady Bunch. Remember that episode with Greg when he was trying to make this girl not like him because Peter really liked the girl. So he sat her down and goes, "Here's a couple rules about dating. You date only me." And she's like, "Okay, I like that. I date whoever I want," Greg says. She goes, "That's not fair." And he goes, "What do you want, fair or me?" And I think sometimes that's what God says to us. What do you want, fair or me? Right? And we have to reconcile that. So anyway, I actually put that on one of my podcasts. All right, well, we'll conclude on that fairly upbeat note. Thank you, everybody, for listening. As usual, any people that listen to or watch this video later, any questions, you can post them in the comments, and I always check. So we'll be back next week. So today's the 5th, right? So we have the 12th and the 19th. And then we go on the nativity break. And I don't think we have another class until after the new year. So God bless everyone. Have a wonderful week. And we will be back next Sunday. Take care.